Hey, good morning, St. Patrick. It's good to be back with you again with my weekly e-video. Excuse me. This is part three in my series on generosity, and I'm continuing to talk about how we put generosity into practice. And today, I want to begin talking about the biblical practice of the tithe. Probably do at least one more video in that, maybe a third, depends how much I get through in this one and the next one. But today, I just want to basically define what that is and talk about how I understand the normative way to practice that is. Tithe is a word that means tenth. And so the biblical practice of the tithe is to take the first tenth of what God has entrusted to us and give it back to Him. In the scriptures, everything we have belongs to God. In fact, Jesus said we can't be His disciples if we don't surrender everything we have to Him. So in a sense, 100% belongs to God, and it's all to be stewarded by us, managed by us for His sake. And of course, we use our resources to meet all kinds of important needs in our life for food, shelter, family, etc. But beginning in the Old Testament and continuing into the teaching of Jesus, we see this practice called the tithe. And the heart of that practice is this, that the first tenth of everything that God has entrusted to us actually belongs to God. So in one sense, the tithe isn't our giving. It's not charity. It's not something we manage and kind of oversee. It's just the first tenth is God's. It is His tithe that talks about in the Scripture. And if you look in Deuteronomy 14 and back in Genesis 18 and some other places where it shows up, Malachi 3 as well, what you see is in the Old Testament, the tithe went to the temple, which was the place of worship. Now, of course, we don't go to a physical temple in the same way as the Old Testament, but as the church, we are the temple. And of course, as we gather in worship, we go to the unseen temple, the real Mount Zion in heaven, in God's presence that's coming back to earth now. So our Christian worship, in a sense, is still our version of temple worship. So my understanding and what we understand as Anglicans and many Christians understand is that the tithe, that tenth, goes to where I worship. So what I believe is the first tenth of what God's entrusted to me, I give back to Him by giving that tenth to my local church. That's how I put that into practice. Now, the Old Testament talks about offerings, so there's giving above that for other places. That can be in the local church or special offerings within the church or outside the church. Those are things where it's more like we have resources and we kind of decide what to do with it. But the tithe is the Lord's. Another principle, and this shows up in Proverbs and a number of places, is that the tithe is first fruits. So that means, for example, in the Old Covenant, people would actually give fruit because they'd raise crops and they'd take the very first part of the harvest, the thing they're waiting all year to get, the very first 10%, and give it to the Lord. Or actually give it back to the Lord. It's His in the first place. So here's how I practice the tithe, and then as I said in a couple more videos, we'll talk a little bit more, look a little more at Scripture and kind of unpack this. Let me say one more thing before I go on. I think a great picture of what the tithe is. The tithe is God's set of training wheels to teach us generosity. The tenth, the tithe, isn't the end of generosity, it's the beginning. It's the platform for which we learn how to be generous people. That's how it's designed in the Scriptures. So we put the tithe into our life and we strap on those spiritual training wheels and those generosity training wheels, and it trains us to be people who are generous with everything we have. And I know in my own life and the testimony of other people's lives, if they put this practice into play in their lives, they don't find that they struggle to be generous anymore. They actually find they're set free and begin to step into generosity in all kinds of other areas. It's a powerful thing, and I think God's designed it to train us to trust Him and to train us to be generous. But let me tell you what we do. I don't say this to brag in the Matthews, but I want you to know that what I teach is something we really actually do. So we just identify our gross income. Both Trudy and I work, and we have an income that comes in. We mark off a tenth of that, and every month 1/10 of our gross income is given to St. Patrick's Church. And for a long time, we were committed to that, but we might go, well, we're a month short here and there, we won't give, we'll kind of cut back. But then about 6 years ago, we made a firm commitment that we will tithe, and our tithe will go to the local church. And that has really released us into a new season of generosity in our life. Now, we're at a life stage where we have A2 incomes, and we've been working for a number of decades. So So, we have some more disposable income than we would earlier in our lives. So we have some freedom in that. So we're able to do other things besides that. But we've made a firm commitment that the tithe, the first tenth, belongs to the Lord. So, for example, we don't divide it up and send it different places because we feel like part of the way we embody the surrendering of that to the Lord is we surrender it to the church. It's a physical way of actually putting into action surrender and release of this to the Lord. So let me close by saying this, and as I said, next week we'll look at some scriptures and maybe even a third week, so we'll spend a little time on this, but I do want to ask you to do this. Would you, if you've not yet put the tithe into practice, I wanted you to ask yourself, why not? Is it because you're afraid to trust God with that? If that's the reason, I'd encourage you to take a step of faith and test God. Malachi 3, we will look at that passage, invites us to actually test God and see if He won't provide our needs. Do you struggle to kind of control your tithe and you don't really release it to the Lord by releasing it to the church? Maybe that's an issue of control and an issue of surrender to the Lord. You need to step into that. Maybe you just want to have money for yourself and you don't want to give that much. I want to encourage you to wrestle with the Lord about that. If you're already practicing the tithe, well done, way to go, keep it up. I'd encourage you to start asking the Lord if He wants you to do beyond that and learn how to grow beyond that. But for all of us, what I'd say is the tithe in the scriptures really is the beginning. It's not the goal, it's the beginning, it's the starting point. And no matter how much we have, we can take 1/10 of it, give it to the Lord through His church. So I'd encourage you to start practicing that if you aren't. And as I said, in the next couple sessions, we'll look at some specific scriptures and do a little more in-depth teaching about that. Have a great week, and God bless.